Okay, folks, welcome back. This is the course in end-of-life bioethics within the program of the Master of Science in Bioethics at St. Thomas University, beginning always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for all your many blessings, Lord. In spite of the difficulties of life, we know that you're with us, that you do not abandon us, particularly in this Easter season when we celebrate the resurrection of your Son, Lord, which is a promise of resurrection for each one of us. May we truly live as people of the resurrection and be able to share that hope of eternal life with those who surround us. We ask your blessings and we ask your Holy Spirit, especially throughout the program and in these courses, as we seek to find your will in our lives and your will in these bioethical issues that involve human life, involve the environment, particularly in this course as we look at the end of our life here on earth. May it be the possibility of a peaceful transition precisely into eternal life. We continue to pray for those who are in most need of your divine mercy at this time. In the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. So, Holy Spirit. Okay, so today we have another hot topic. We go from hot topics to hot topics here. And this one is on euthanasia. And under the umbrella of euthanasia or mercy killing, right? We have physician-assisted suicide and the variants of that phrase, physician-assisted death, etc. We'll look at all the variants of that little phrase. And then what would be healthy alternatives to euthanasia or mercy killing, hospice or palliative care, and we'll see the distinction between those two. And then one that is still controversial today bioethically, called terminal sedation. And then so we'll make the critical distinction again between killing or allowing to die. That is a critical bioethical distinction between killing or allowing to die. We'll review that again. And then in the second part of the lecture today, we'll look at some case studies and a little very brief history of how this euthanasia or mercy killing movement is gaining an increasing grounds and support throughout the United States and in other parts of the world. So without further ado, let's go into the topic then. Euthanasia originally in its etymology or the origin of the word, the origin and the meaning of the word comes from the Greek thanatos, euthanatos, and thanatos in Greek is death. And the prefix means good or true or healthy, all right? So a true good death. That was the original meaning of euthanasia or euthanatos in Greek. And it does go back more than 2,000 years to classical Greece, 300-400 years before the time of Christ. Meaning to have a good or true or peaceful death, in contrast to a violent death, either by an accident or by a tragic illness or something like that, all right? So a good death, a peaceful death, we would say today. That was the original meaning of the word euthanatos, which today is translated into euthanasia. And then over the centuries, euthanasia has been categorized into two groups, either active or passive euthanasia, active or passive euthanasia. And the distinction between them is basically either actively engaging in the death of someone, or passive is by neglect of essential means to stay alive. All right, so one, the act of euthanasia was interpreted as actively killing someone or being associated with the killing of someone, typically with medication or some kind of poison, whereas passive euthanasia would be denying a person the basic needs of survival, denying them, for example, food or water or something like that, that is basic need for survival, and thus letting the person die when that person's life could have been saved, all right? But those distinctions are now passé, they're no longer used really, and euthanasia today is interpreted pretty much in the active sense of causing the death of someone, and the intention is to alleviate the suffering. So you see that in the current understanding of euthanasia, there's both the means and the ends are clustered together in the current definition or understanding of euthanasia. In other words, the end is to alleviate suffering, which in principle is a good end. However, the means is causing the death of that person. You see, causing the death of that person. Therefore, we have right away the distinction between two camps of how we do bioethics, either a utilitarian bioethics or a principle bioethics. And I've talked about this before several times, and it's at the core of the way bioethics is being done today. So that with a utilitarian bioethics, because the end is a good end, the goal is to alleviate suffering, then the means are justified. Kill the person. Kill the person because they're suffering. They're in intractable pain and suffering. And by the way, here suffering is also, it includes pain, all right? So when we say suffering, actually it means pain and or suffering. All right, and we're talking about serious intractable pain that perhaps has gone beyond the possibility of being regulated with medication, at least at the conscience level. At any rate, for utilitarian bioethics, euthanasia is justified because the end, the goal is a good one, and so the means, whatever means to achieve that goal, as long as it's legal. And that's why, jumping a little bit ahead here, the active movement of euthanasia today in the United States and in many other parts of the world, the idea is to get it legalized. Get it legalized so that it's not illegal, we're not breaking the law. And that's the only standard really there. And so it becomes a legalistic issue. As long as it's legal, then leave it alone. All right, so that is the current understanding of euthanasia, which is, as it were, active euthanasia to actually cause the death of the patient, typically by administering a lethal dosage of some medication. That still needs to be prescribed because as a lethal dosage, these medications are by prescription only. Still, so far, it's not over-the-counter medication, unless it's a real heavy overdose of some kind of over-the-counter medication, like a painkiller or something like that, but that's not the standard case. All right, so let's look at some definitions also within the medical field and within the field of bioethics, because again, we're gonna find some discrepancy here. And these are just some definitions that are available online to the public, all right? And these first ones are, these are medical definitions. So these are medical definitions, and therefore they're a little bit removed from the ethical or the bioethical analysis, all right? For example, MedicineNet, which is a very popular online source of medical information, defines euthanasia simply as the practice of intentionally ending a life in order to relieve pain and suffering. So again, you see here, pain and suffering are put together. And number one, but more importantly, it brings out the intention, right? The intention is the ending of a life, typically a human life, all right? Because we're talking about medicine, so the practice of medicine on human beings is desiring the end of a human life to relieve, this is the goal, to relieve pain and suffering. The means or the desire, the intention is to end that person's life actively. Follow? All right. Another one from the medical dictionary, which is also online for free. Deliberate ending of a life of a person suffering from incurable disease. So here is a terminal illness, and that's why the diagnosis is very important, because the diagnosis determines the prognosis, right? So the person is in incurable disease, meaning terminal, medically terminal illness. There's no more cure for this person. Okay, so what's the care? The care is to end their life, right? And so again, you can see the active component here. And this today in medical understanding includes withholding extraordinary means or heroic measures of life support. And this would end the person. But you see here, it's a little ambiguous because we're withholding extraordinary means, which we would accept as ethical or moral because there's no obligation to undergo extraordinary means of life support. There's no ethical obligation. We talked about that, right? And so it puts it in, it's a little ambiguous because allowing the patient to die is different from killing the person or intending deliberate ending the life of a person. So it's a little ambiguous in the definition here, whether we are allowing a person to die or are we actually killing the person? All right, so it also goes back into a little brief historical setting in the medical dictionary. This is all part of the same definition in the medical dictionary, all right? Talks about traditionally or historically, what I mentioned, active or passive euthanasia, right? Active or passive. Active also defined as positive euthanasia, meaning something is being done, the deliberate ending of a life, and an action is taken to cause the death of a person, all right? So if an action is taken to cause the death of a person, then we're not really allowing the person to die, we are killing the person. That is active or positive euthanasia. Traditionally, that is the understanding. Whereas negative or passive euthanasia is withholding life-preventing procedures and treatments that would prolong the life of one who is incurably or terminally ill and could not survive without that life support. So withholding or withdrawing that life support, that is what is known as, used to be known as passive or negative euthanasia. See? So the action here is really a non-action, is withholding or withdrawing the life support system of someone who they're terminally ill, but they're not dead yet. Okay, so it clarifies again, the medical dictionary definition clarifies that today, euthanasia is understood as active euthanasia. Foregoing life sustainment treatments is replacing passive euthanasia. So you see how they're trying to stay away, in the wording, they're trying to stay away from the ethical decisions. They're trying to make it as ethically neutral as possible. Foregoing life-sustaining treatment. They're leaving it in the concept of an option. I have an option to either engage or forego something, right? They're trying to make it as ethically neutral as possible in the language. Another definition, this one is more broad. This is from Merriam-Webster, which is not a medical dictionary, but it's a very well-known and used dictionary throughout the whole world. And it's, again, online, so it's a more generic definition because you'll see it will include humans and non-humans. So the act or practice of killing or permitting the death. So here we have either killing or allowing to die, right? Permitting the death of hopelessly sick or injured individuals, and it could be a person or a domestic animal. So they don't make a distinction between what, normally with pets, right? With pets, let's say a cat or a dog who is either very old and in pain, or may have developed cancer, for example, or gotten into an accident, hit by a car, and it would take $50,000 to put the dog or the cat back together, and the owners don't have $50,000 to spend on the pet. So they put them to sleep, right? Put them to sleep is a euphemism for euthanizing the pet. And that's why this definition from Merriam-Webster is broader. It could be human or not human, put them to sleep. Relatively painless way for reasons of mercy. So again, the intention or the goal is, a good goal is a benevolent goal, is to be merciful, but we can see that the problem with this particular definition is that it doesn't really distinguish between a human or non-human. Whereas, at least in principle of bioethics, we will make a very clear distinction between human and non-human. And whereas it could be ethical to put a dog, a pet dog or a pet animal to sleep, meaning to euthanize the animal, right? It may not be ethical to do the same to a human being, to a person. And so you see that already in the medical profession, there's ambiguity here between, it's not clear whether euthanasia is used as allowing a person to die, a person who is terminally ill, there's no more cure, it's a matter of hours or days, and this person is actively dying, so we allow them to die, keep them comfort care, or actively killing the person, again, because they are terminally ill, and now we administer that medication that is actually a poison for the person, all right? Typically causing a heart attack, which is an overdose of potassium chloride is what is done. Or anyway, so now let's look at the bioethical definition of euthanasia from the principle perspective, from principle bioethics, and I'm using, again, the ERDs, specifically the two directives, number 60 and 61 from the ERDs. And this obviously is in the 5th section of the document, the 5th part, which is the part on the end-of-life issues. So directive number 60 states, euthanasia is an action or omission that of itself or by intention causes death in order to alleviate suffering. So again, it's picking up from the understanding, the current understanding of euthanasia that is in society today, in the ethos of our culture, to alleviate suffering. So the end is good, but the means and the intention is causing the death of that patient. Catholic healthcare institutions may never condone or participate in euthanasia, the way it's been defined, or assisted suicide, and they introduce this alternative language, assisted suicide, in any way. Dying patients, so what's the alternative? Dying patients who request euthanasia should receive loving care, psychological and spiritual support, and appropriate remedies for pain and other symptoms so that they can live with dignity until the time of natural death. Natural death meaning that God determines when we die. And we will die, so it's not a question of if we die, it's a question of when we die. And that when should belong to God really as the author of our lives. So just like we did not ask to be alive, we didn't tell our parents to conceive us, right? That is a gift, and our life is a gift from God, and it was God who determined that, yes, through the biological process of our parents' fertilization, but we did not have a choice there. So we were given life as a gift, and we are stewards of this life, and then, at least from the principal perspective, it is also God who determines when he calls us to himself, all right? So that's this directive number 60 is very clear that from principal bioethics, we do not engage in euthanasia or the one of the alternative phrasing of assisted suicide. And we'll look at this alternative phrasing as it has panned out into other alternative phrasing, evermore trying to take away the sting of the suicide. Okay, because suicide in itself already carries a negative connotation, of course. All right, then the next directive, 61, right away, is trying to clarify that whereas we reject euthanasia, we embrace the compassionate care of those who are terminally ill or actively dying. So patients should be kept as free of pain as possible, so that they may die comfortably and with dignity. So this is talking about the medication that is necessary, essentially painkillers, yes, in an increasing dosage as the pain overcomes the medication, and then that dosage needs to be increased, knowing that one of the side effects of that increasing painkiller is also killing neurons on the brain and pushing the person further and further to unconsciousness. We know that medically, but that's not the intention. It is a side effect of the intention of alleviating pain. And in the place where they wish to die, which is another thing, I'll talk about this in a minute, because now we have an increasing number of people, at least in the United States and other parts of the world, not dying at home, not dying with their loved ones, okay, but dying in an institution, typically a nursing home or hospital, and it's beyond 60% of the American population already is dying away from their home today. And that number is increasing, it's not decreasing. It's also happening in Europe. It's one of these paradoxes and sad statements of contemporary societies that have more well-being. Typically, more and more people are dying away from their loved ones in some kind of an institutional setting. Since a person has the right to prepare for his or her death while fully conscious, he or she should not be deprived of consciousness without a compelling reason. Again, it comes down to the titration or the dosage of the medication of the painkiller. Medicines capable of alleviating or suppressing pain may be given to a dying person, even if this therapy may indirectly shorten the person's life. Why is it indirectly? Because it is not willed or desired, but it is a side effect that the painkillers render the person less and less conscious. So long as the intent is not to hasten death, you see, so the intent is not to kill the person. Patients experiencing suffering that cannot be alleviated should be helped to appreciate the Christian understanding of redemptive suffering. Now, the last sentence is extremely important when we talk about principal bioethics. Why? Because it takes it to a different level. So far, we have been concentrating mostly on the pain and even suffering of the individual patient, right, who is dying, they're actively dying, and the understanding is that they are in pain. If there's no pain, then there's no painkiller needed. But if the person is in pain, beginning with the physiological level, and that pain may be causing suffering, so now we've gone into the psychological level, right? Then that person should also be given the option to consider, while they are still conscious, consider the redemptive value of suffering, the redemptive value of suffering. In other words, that takes it to the spiritual level, beyond the physical, beyond the psychological, into the spiritual level, precisely the level of the conscience of the person, the soul, that there is value in suffering, not that we seek suffering, but look, sooner or later in life, some suffering will come. It may be minor, it may be major. For example, the standard in life is that we bury our parents. Our parents buried their parents and so forth. That's the standard. Tragic is when parents have to bury their children, because that is a reversal of the natural order of things in the world, okay, in life. And normally and logically and understandably, that will bring some suffering to our lives, to bury our parents, okay? However, we know that sooner or later it's going to happen, and there is redemptive meaning and possibility for that. In other words, at the end of the day, we have two options that are mutually exclusive. Either we become frustrated, we try to deny and fight the pain or suffering that will come into our lives at some point, and we try to deny it, and we'll become frustrated about it because it's still there. Okay. Or we embrace it, again, not that we seek it, we're not masochists, but we embrace it and make something good out of it. We offer it up. Those three key words that maybe our grandparents taught us, our grandmother when we were kids, and offer it up, okay? Offer it up. In other words, we have a chance of making something good out of the sufferings in our life. And that good ultimately is an identification with the sufferings of Christ, specifically his passion and death, all right? Because if there is one person who was innocent in this life and in human history, it was Jesus Christ, as the incarnation of God, because of the folly of love, that he loves us so immensely that he became one of us, to walk in our ways and to show us how to walk this humanity with meaning, all right, and with dignity. So back in the 1980s, already more than 40 years ago, when this whole euthanasia movement started in society actively, in Europe and then here in the United States, the Vatican came out with a document that is called a Declaration on Euthanasia. Okay? Declaration on Euthanasia. And it's interesting because there's a certain sequence there. First began the issues, the bioethical issues at the beginning of human life, beginning with contraception and then abortion and then in vitro fertilization in the 60s and the 70s, as we saw. And then in the 80s began the movement of euthanasia, in other words, at the end of life. If you notice in the bigger picture for human life, those are the two most vulnerable moments of our life. On average, those are the two most vulnerable moments of our life. The beginning of our lives when we are radically dependent on our mothers, at least for 9 months in her womb. And then at the end of life, again, where we become more feeble, physically and mentally, and again, we become more and more dependent on other people to make decisions for us, even to give us basic care, right? So the two most vulnerable times of our lives, toward the beginning and toward the end, began to be attacked actively through a utilitarian mentality that if it's a problem, get rid of the problem, okay? Just get rid of the problem. So the Vatican put out a document in 1980, Declaration of Euthanasia, which is very, very solid and very meaningful to this day. That is the site there. You can go directly to the site. and look it up. But within that document, there is a section that talks about redemptive suffering, precisely, redemptive suffering. All right, you can even just punch Declaration on Euthanasia or Euthanasia, just Vatican, for example. Document will come up, there it is, in English or whatever other language you want. This is the document. So first, the value of human life as such, that we are stewards of our life and life is a gift. Then it defines euthanasia in detail. Then here it is, the meaning of suffering for Christians. And then finally, due proportion, in other words, that a person may be given painkillers in an increase in dosage, as long as the intention is not to kill the person, but rather to alleviate the suffering. All right, so that's the document there. It's not that long, but it's very, very solid in the Judeo-Christian tradition of principal bioethics. And the bottom line is this vicarious reparation to suffer on behalf of others. Behalf of others who may need the offering up of our suffering. And again, it is the example of Christ, the only innocent one. Through his own suffering, he redeemed all of us. He redeemed all sin of all humanity. From the first humans, whom biblically we call Adam and Eve, and we saw in the evolutionary process back to the first hominins, in the Homo genus, all right? Anywhere between 2 million to 200,000 years ago when the species, when the human, or at least the human genus began, up until to the last human that will exist here on earth. Our sins have been redeemed in the sufferings of Christ. So we identify with those sufferings when we offer up our own sufferings, just like Jesus did for our salvation. So there's tremendous richness here, spiritual richness. And I can tell you this can be tremendous comfort also, especially for a person who is dying and the medication is working less and less, and they continue to feel that pain, even if it's just for a few hours or even a few days, to talk about the spiritual realities that their suffering has a lot of meaning and a lot of value to many other people, then that is a source of comfort. I may actually allow that person to die in peace, okay? So that takes it all the way up to the spiritual level, which is the highest capacity of the human that we have. Back then to some of the alternative phrasing that is being used, because understandably, we know, and we're realistic about the fact that not everyone is involved in principal bioethics in our society. And in fact, most people, frankly, are not actively or systematically involved in ethics. They don't really process their ethical decisions in a systematic way or formal way as we do when we think about it and when we study it and talk about it, all right? And therefore, kind of the default, just intuitively, is to fall into a utilitarian mentality because it's very prevalent in our society. We are constantly geared into problem solving, seeing life as a series of problems that need to be solved, all right? And so using that same framework, that mental frame of solving problems, we apply it also to issues of human life and human death. And therefore, by default, many times people fall into a utilitarian mentality looking at the end of life issues. And so it comes down to not put them out of their misery, but put them out of our misery. In other words, their pain and suffering is causing me pain and suffering, or their pain is causing me suffering. And so I put them out of their pain so that I get rid of my suffering. These dynamics many times are not conscious, but they're there. And it's important then to thematize them, to bring them up so that we become aware of them and we make other people around us aware of the subconscious dynamics that are going on. Because like I say, this movement of euthanasia from the utilitarian pragmatic mentality is increasing in the United States and has already increased also a lot in Europe and other parts of the world. But typically, it is the most developed countries, the most developed industrialized countries that are falling into this pitfall of legalizing euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. So let's look at the difference between these two. It's a technical difference, but it makes a difference between legal or illegal. And again, keep in mind that the utilitarian camp is telling us, well, the ends will justify the means as long as it doesn't break the law. So they will never counsel us to break the law, as long as it's not illegal. So the intent and the whole purpose becomes to legalize it. To this day, euthanasia is illegal in the United States, okay? It's already legal in a number of countries in Europe. Significantly, Belgium, for example, and other Benelux countries and Scandinavian countries in Northern Europe, but it's extending throughout other parts of Europe. The point is that euthanasia in the United States, as defined as the active killing of someone else, is still legal, thanks be to God. So I may not kill someone else, even for the purpose of mercy, when that other person is suffering intractably. But if the other person requests it, then it may become physician-assisted suicide. In other words, I, as a patient who am dying, say, from cancer, and no longer want any more therapy because my cancer is incurable. And we'll see a case in the second half of the lecture of a brain tumor, the case of a brain tumor that was incurable, okay? I may not want any more therapy, and I have the option, the ethical option to refuse therapy. But to take it a step further and to ask the physician to prescribe the lethal dosage, that is physician-assisted suicide. See? Physician-assisted suicide, and that was the original alternative phrasing or paraphrasing of euthanasia, and it's known by its acronym as PAS. The PAS, the acronyms here are very significant because they're meaningful, all right? And I've noticed in my half a century of living in the United States that American society in general, it's kind of, they're fond of, many institutions are fond of their acronyms because they're meaningful and symbolic. I see that, for example, in Congress when they craft a law and the acronym of that law, okay? It's very symbolic. So PAS, even though it's written with only one S because it's physician-assisted suicide, right? Is the acronym of physician-assisted suicide. It has the meaning of passing a person along, passing a person from this life to the other life, to eternal life. Whatever your belief is about eternal life, you are passing on. You're moving on to eternal life, okay? So already it has, the acronym has that appeal of passing, making that passage from this life to the other life, whatever it is that you believe in after death, okay? So, but then the euphemisms or the alternative phrasing continues to get sweeter, if you will, sweeter, because there's still a word here that is impalatable in this phrasing, physician-assisted suicide. Whoops, suicide. Now, straight up suicide without the adjective, straight up suicide is still illegal in the United States. I don't have a right to kill myself. In fact, if I express suicide ideation, in other words, if I tell someone that I am thinking of killing myself, and I talk about the means, in other words, if I describe some kind of means that I have thought about, okay, that person has a grave responsibility to report me so that I may be restrained and not follow through. Just the ideation, just the thinking about suicide. So to this day, suicide straight up is still illegal in the United States. We don't have a right to kill ourselves, okay? And straight up suicide. But physician-assisted suicide is becoming increasingly legal. And I can tell you again, because I'll show you the little chart, already 11 states of the 50 states in the United States, all right, 11 states, so more than 20% of the states in the nation have already legalized physician-assisted suicide in some form. Physician-assisted suicide, legal, where the doctor is prescribing the lethal dosage, but I take the lethal dosage, and that's why it's suicide. All right, so the doctor is not killing me. The doctor is just prescribing the lethal dosage. But the actual action, the physical action of taking that dosage is, I do it, it's mine. So the doctor can say, well, he didn't have to take it, right? So I'm not killing the person, I'm just prescribing, I'm just putting the poison next to the bed. They don't have to take it, but they can take it if they want to, it's their choice. So again, it's under this whole movement of patient rights interpreted in an absolute way, All right, so to start taking away the sting of the suicide, now they substitute suicide with death. And what do we have? Physician-assisted death. You see, it's a death. It's a death. So physician-assisted suicide, physician-assisted death, acronym is a PAD, like a pad in the back. We pad you along to eternal life. You follow? The acronyms get sweeter and sweeter as we go along. Aid in dying, aid in dying. So I'm dying because I have terminal illness, and the doctor and the nurse and the medical team, they're just helping me out. They're helping me die, right? So aid in dying. We want to help people, we want to aid people. So now it's becoming a good thing in the acronym. How about medical aid in dying? Because it is the doctor who's prescribing the medication, right? And it's the pharmacist who is dispensing it, and it is the nurse who is administering it. So medical aid in dying, MAID. Or physician aid in dying, paid, because he's going to charge for that service. Anyway, these are the acronyms, but the one that is sticking the most is just this one, AID, which is the simplest one. There's a simplicity about it, just aid in dying, okay? And we pass no judgment on whether it's a suicide or a homicide or what kind of a side it is. It's just an aid. Well, from the principle of bioethics, any of these is unethical because it is either killing, actively killing the patient or desiring the death of the patient, all right? Desiring the death of the patient, yes, for the goal of alleviating the suffering. But the idea then, what's the alternative? And what would be the ethically, the moral alternative, the ethically good alternative with regards to principle bioethics is not to desire the death of the patient, but to desire the alleviation of the suffering or the pain or suffering, okay? So it does come to medication, but it's a dosage issue. It's not the overdose, let's say morphine, which is the classical pain relief, right? It's a question of the dosage of the morphine. We give sufficient morphine to the patient to kill the pain, but not an overdose of morphine to kill the patient. So it does come down in many cases to the dosage, because the dosage is according to the intention. All right, so the healthy alternatives are essentially either hospice or palliative care, okay? Hospice or palliative care, both of which have the same goal, which is to relieve the pain and the suffering of a dying patient. But they are managed a little differently, and that's why there are two separate categories, hospice or palliative care. So let's look at those a little bit, and then we'll go for the break after that, more or less. So what they have in common, hospice and palliative care, is that they are caring for the patient. Again, I mentioned earlier, there is no more cure for this patient. There's no more cure because now the patient has a terminal illness. In other words, medicine has its limits. The practice of medicine has its limits. We can't cure every single disease or illness that is out there, all right, or condition. In fact, every patient is going to die sooner or later. So we can say in the biggest of pictures with regards to human health is that life itself is a terminal illness. People say even sarcastically, when we're born, we begin to die. Well, even before we're born, when we're conceived, we have begun to die because the more time passes, the closer we are to our death, whenever that death is going to be. All right, so we can look at life either from conception forward or from death backwards. And as time passes, that gap is getting smaller and smaller. All right, so back to the case of care. When there's no more cure for a patient, every medication and every practice is going to have a limit. Care always obligates, okay? Care, basic care, always obligates because it is ordinary means of life support, which come down to the four that we talked about: nutrition, hydration, shelter, and human interaction, okay? All right, so then what are some differences between hospice or palliative care? It has to do with the place, the timing, the payment, and even the treatment that may be available. So for example, with regards to the place, the actual place where the care takes place, all right? Hospice typically is at home, whereas palliative care is in a hospital or a clinical setting. Now, this home could be the actual home of the patient or a nursing home, which is kind of a substitute of the home, the individual home of the patient, all right? So that's why nursing homes are called nursing homes and not nursing hospitals, because the type of care that is provided is the basic care, and no real cures are supposed to go on in a nursing home. People there are essentially waiting to die, in the sense that healings are not supposed to happen in a nursing home. That happens in a hospital, when there is still a prognosis that is a positive prognosis, that there's hope of recovery. But when there is no hope of recovery, when the prognosis is extremely poor, then it means that somehow death is around the corner, okay? So again, hospice occurs in home, either a nursing home or in the person's actual home, whereas palliative care occurs in a more structured or in a clinical setting or hospital setting. The timing also makes a difference because hospice is typically within 6 months. The expectation is that the person will die within 6 months. And this is arbitrary, okay? There's nothing magic about this number. It doesn't mean that everybody dies within 6 months. It could be 3 days later after the person is declared terminal with a terminal illness, right? And they could die a few hours or a few days after that declaration by the doctor of the terminal illness. And by the way, that diagnosis, that terminal illness, qualifies the person for hospice or palliative care, all right? So that's the diagnosis, which is done by the competent doctor, physician. Or it could be that they went beyond 6 months. So they have a terminal cancer, but they're now 2 years out. And they're still in hospice. So 6 months is kind of an arbitrary number because most cases of terminal illness die within 6 months, all right? So it's a statistical thing, but for each individual, it could be more or less than that. Whereas in palliative care, there's no really specified time because it's a different focus. Since they are in a hospital setting where typically there can be more aggressive measures of life support available, okay, like for example, intubation, then there is no specified time for palliative care in a hospital setting. Also, chronic, for example, chronic pain or chronic illness means that it is lifelong, but not necessarily life-threatening. Okay, so the patient may not necessarily be dying, but they have a chronic illness. All right, also the payment makes a difference because typically in hospice, it's not covered by all insurance. It depends on the type of insurance that the person has. It is covered by Medicare. So the elderly in general, when we go into Medicare, that covers hospice. In fact, Medicare has figured out that it actually costs less to die at home than to die in a hospital setting, because then the hospital setting has such huge overheads to maintain the infrastructure that it's much more expensive on a per diem basis, on a daily basis, to maintain a dying patient at home. I mean, in a hospital, more expensive than at home. All right, and that's typically why Medicare covers it, covers hospice, so that person may in fact die at home. Whereas palliative care, it typically goes through hospital billing. So if the patient has medical insurance and they're on palliative care in a hospital, then that insurance will also pick up the tab of the palliative care. Finally, on treatment, again, there is a difference because in hospice, basically the person is given just comfort care, all right? But very few medications, just a medication that the patient has been taking. For example, if they have other conditions, if they're diabetic, they will be giving insulin and so forth. But no medication that is intended to cure the patient. Antibiotics are a little controversial whether they're provided or not under hospice care at home, all right? Sometimes they are. It really depends on each patient and the condition of the patient. But antibiotics, they try not to go that route in a home setting. Even though I have seen it, giving antibiotics, if the prognosis is very, very positive, that a short course of antibiotics may help this person that, in addition to being dying from a cancer, for example, I know specifically, I'm thinking of a case of an elderly person who had colon cancer, and the cancer was progressing. They were in hospice at their home, and then they developed a pneumonia on top of that, accidentally, opportunistic. And so they were given a course of antibiotics at home, but then that requires a nurse, a registered nurse, to monitor, and that brings up the price, the ticket. And so generally in hospice, they try not to get into those kind of settings. But however, with palliative care, because they are precisely in a hospital setting, okay, then sometimes a little more aggressive treatments or life-prolonging treatments may be available with palliative care. Again, it depends on each patient, it depends on the protocol, it depends a lot on how the doctor, on the diagnosis and the prognosis, right? So invariably, they do have to go patient by patient to make these distinctions, fine distinctions. Backing out overall, then we can say that a healthy alternative to euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide is to put the person on palliative care or on hospice, all right, which will manage the pain, and the focus is, again, killing the pain and not killing the patient. All right, let's look at this terminal sedation or palliative sedation as an alternative phrasing, because like I mentioned, this one is still a little controversial. It depends on what is meant by terminal sedation. or how it's actually administered. So first of all, a general definition is relieving the stress in a terminally ill person. So the person is dying, actively dying, all right? The last hours or days. So you see the time lapse is very short. The patient is expected to die anytime now. They're actively, imminently dying. Talking about hours, days at the most. And usually by means of a continuous intravenous or subcutaneous infusion. In other words, a drip line in an IV drip of a sedative drug. In other words, they are trying to render the person unconscious so that they don't feel as much pain. That's the goal here with terminal sedation. You see, sedation, to sedate the person, is to put them to sleep, not figuratively, but literally, to render the person unconscious. And sometimes, if the person is elderly, for example, and they have very frail veins and so forth, it's difficult to run an IV to get a drip line established, right? And after several or many attempts, or maybe they have had previous lines put on their hands, on their neck, even on the legs and so forth, and they cannot find another entry way through the circulatory system. There is even another option, which is that the sedative is administered rectally through the rectum, all right, through the anus, and it's kind of like an enema, where the intestine themselves will actually absorb the medication into the circulatory system and then eventually to the brain, all right? So that's kind of a last resort there. It is done through a kind of an enema. So there are possibilities of administering this sedative, right? A sedative, meaning to render the person unconscious. It is seen as a last resort, number one. Number two, the person is in intractable pain. In other words, other painkillers are not doing the work. And here I want to make the distinction between a painkiller, which is an analgesic, is one type of medication, whereas a sleeping medication is a sedative. And there are different types of medications because they have different purposes. All right, so analgesic is trying to manage the pain, and typically they are opioids, yes, and they are addictive and so forth. Morphine is the most common one, but then some people are actually allergic to morphine, so they need an analog or an alternative. Whereas a sedative is not meant as a painkiller, but it's meant mostly to put a person to sleep, literally unconscious. And then we don't really know if the person is unconscious. We don't know if they're feeling the pain or not, truly, all right? Because we have no access, and since they're asleep, they're not demonstrating anything. But sometimes they grimace and they do things with their face, and then we can tell from that they are still in pain, and then the dosage will be increased, and that's called a titration. So again, the idea is to manage the pain, not to kill the patient, right? So it's not euthanasia, it's to manage the pain. Very clear, that's the intention. And titration is a drip. Essentially, the drip, the rate of drip, the amount of the dosage and the drip rate, it's foreseen that will increase, the dosage will increase. And we know that the opioids, for example, yes, they're going to be killing nerve cells, all right? So the person will become more and more unconscious, and long-term, it will affect the brain. But the understanding is that the person will die from the terminal illness before the person dies from the analgesic or the sedative itself, the large doses, the increasing dosage of the painkiller or the sedative, all right? And again, this one is with regards to the intention. If it is to sedate the patient into unconsciousness, then it is, but If the idea is to sedate the patient, yes, sedate the patient into unconsciousness, of course, once they're unconscious, then how are we going to supply nutrition and hydration? Nutrition and hydration stops. Then this could be considered euthanasia because we're actually depriving the person of nutrition and or hydration because we have sedated the person into unconsciousness and now they just can't eat or drink. You follow? And the intention here, there's no intention to intubate the person with a peg, with a tube to the stomach. We'll cover nutrition and hydration next lecture in much more detail. But for now, if the intention is just to sedate the patient into unconsciousness, to put them to sleep, literally, right? Without provision for nutrition and hydration, then we're basically starving the person to death or dehydrating, because we'll die from dehydration way before we die of malnutrition. Okay, water, fluid is much more critical on a daily basis than food. We can go without food, we'll get hungry and we'll start self-consumption of the body, but we can go several days, several weeks without eating, depending on how plump we were before when we started. But dehydration within days without water, if the kidneys are still working and flushing out water with toxins, then we dehydrate to death, okay? And so that would be considered euthanasia. So again, a lot depends on the intention. If it is to manage the pain, yes, then we focus strictly on that. But if it is to just sedate the person into unconsciousness without provision for nutrition and hydration, well then we've crossed the line and now we are doing euthanasia on the patient. So that's why I say terminal sedation or palliative sedation is critical. It depends. It depends on the intention. Mm-hmm. All right, so before we get into the cases that we're going to talk about in the second half, just want to pick up again the clinical distinction that we talked about before in this course, the distinction between killing or allowing to die. All right, killing, we may never kill a person ethically. We may never kill a person actively, all right? But we may allow people to die because sooner or later, we're all gonna die. So even though this may sound hard at first, allow a person to die, well, it depends. Are we allowing a person to die out of neglect because they cannot feed themselves, but they're not necessarily dying? Then that would be really killing the person. Follow? Or really allowing a person to die in the healthy sense that if we don't allow persons to die, that's untenable. That we cannot sustain that. We have to allow people to die sooner or later, but only when we become terminal, when we are actively dying as such, okay? So again, a lot depends on the diagnosis and then the prognosis based on that diagnosis. Do I already have a terminal illness? And then what is, there's no hope of recovery if it's terminal, but then what is the prognosis? What is the layout? More or less than 6 months, more or less, which is kind of the guidepost there for qualifying for either hospice or palliative care. All right, let me stop here and we'll take a little break. It's 10:40, 10 minutes. We'll be back by 10:50, more or less, and start the second half where we're going to see very briefly the history of the euthanasia movement in the United States, very briefly, and then look at a couple of cases with Dr. Kevorkian. Dr. Kevorkian, known as Dr. Death here in the United States, and then one case of a patient who had a brain tumor, terminal brain tumor, and how that developed. Okay, so 10-minute break. Let me pause this. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. And get started on the second half here. So again, we left off with the critical distinction between killing someone or allowing someone to die. the killing would be unethical, but the allowing to die is actually an ethical thing. So now, moving forward, let's look at briefly the history of physician-assisted suicide in the United States, and then some key figures in this development. It started back in the 80s with something known as the Hemlock Society. Now, if you recall, hemlock is the poison that Socrates took after his trial. He was tried for basically treason to the state, to the Greek state. And it was a very convoluted thing, which I don't have time to go into, but basically Socrates was given the option to either kill himself or have the state kill him, because he was given the death sentence. And he chose, like in an honorable thing, sadly, to kill himself. And so he was given the poison, and the poison was hemlock. So ever since, this poison hemlock, which comes from a plant, is symbolic of suicide, but also it's also symbolic of that's the, let's say, the high road that Socrates took when he was tried unfairly and given this option. Okay, so there has that background, and it's truly very, very sad and tragic that Socrates took this route, because then it gives a certain validity or legitimacy, being such a brilliant mind and one of the founders of Western philosophy and so forth, that he chose to poison himself, essentially. At any rate, the movement for the right to die, it was initially called the Hemlock Society. And then it morphed a little bit in the year 2000. So about 20 years later, 2 decades later, they started morphing the name because Hemlock Society was a little too academic, maybe. And it was the Right to Die movement and assisted suicide. They had their motto, their saying, their lemma was a good death and a good, a good life and a good death. In other words, I am the master of my life, and when I want out, then I want to have a good death also, right? So good life, good death, they're very catchy phrases that are appealing, especially in our American mentality of freedom of expression and freedom to do what I want with my life and so forth. It started in California with 4 people, with a couple, Derek and Ann Humphrey, and then also Jerry Laurie and Faye Gersh. These were the 4 people who started this movement, like I say, in the 80s in California. And then at the end of the 80s, they relocated to Oregon because they were getting a lot of pushback in California. And they figured that a safer place to be and to promote their cause was in Oregon, because it was a more laid-back state and not as prominent as California or busy and so forth. So they moved to Oregon. And then in 2003, that's because Hemlock Society goes to 1980 to 2003, they changed the name to End of Life Choices. Okay, End of Life Choices. So here is the beginning of the introduction of these little buzzwords that have a lot of appeal in our American culture, in our American ethos, right? The ethical culture of our time. We're into choice, we're into freedom. So these buzzwords are appealing. And instead of the Hemlock Society that had kind of a negative feeling, these people are just advocating to kill themselves. Let's put in choices, which is a buzzword, like for example, pro-choice, as opposed to pro-abortion, which is really what it is, pro-choice, but there's only one choice being considered here, the choice of the pregnant mom, not the choice of the unborn child, right? Because we can assume that no normal unborn child wants to be aborted. Okay, so when we say pro-choice in the pro-abortion movement, we're only talking about the choice of the mother, not the choice of her unborn baby. All right, but it's a buzzword, and it appeals to, like I say, our American ethics and culture of freedom of choice. Then, a year later, Derek Humphrey and Faye Gersh, two of the original founders, right? They founded this network called Final Exit. And the idea was to use the modern means of communication and mass media and social media and so forth to start reaching more people, to make a ground movement, a groundswell movement of people who are kindred spirits. In other words, people who thought like them, that I should have a choice to decide when I live and when I die, right? So again, it's the whole idea of patient rights interpreted in an absolute way. That it really end up telling the patient, that me, the patient, tells the doctor what I want done and what I don't want done. Then finally, the last merger, if you will, was to merge this federation that had developed Compassion in Dying and to morph finally into Compassion and Choices. Okay, and this is the current, to this day, this is their name now of this organization and mindset, mentality, compassion, and choices. So it's gone in 40 years, all the way from the Hemlock Society, that I have the freedom to poison myself, to compassion and choices, that I have the freedom to poison myself. All right, so the underlying premise is still the same, but now, of course, it's much more appealing because who doesn't want choices and who doesn't want to be compassionate, right? So if we're not compassionate, we're being cruel. We're being cruel because we're not allowing this person to die. Well, it turns out it's not that we're not allowing the person to die, we're not allowing the person to kill themselves. And that's why this distinction is crucial and critical. Suicide is not allowing a person to die, it's killing oneself. And we have to say it clearly for what it is. So compassion and choices is a contemporary euphemism, again, to take away the sting of the fact that the patient wants to kill herself or himself. Okay? So what is the strategy? The strategy of this Compassion and Choices movement is to go not at the federal level, as was done with the legalization of abortion back in the 70s, to take a legal case all the way up the court system to the Supreme Court, okay? Because today, since euthanasia continues to be illegal in the United States, that legal battle may be too risky. But what is the alternative to end up having the same effect in the end? This is a very, very slick strategy that these people are doing, is to go state by state, because it's much easier on average to gain state legislation that will promote physician-assisted suicide or will legalize, sorry, maybe promote is not the proper word, because a law doesn't promote truly, a law just legalizes a procedure, okay? So to legalize physician-assisted suicide in every single state, but we go state by state, step by step, one step at a time, right? Okay, so that's Compassion and Choices. And in fact, the first state that fell to this mentality was Oregon in 1994. So 6 years after they started this procedure, okay, 6 years after they moved to Oregon, in 88, they got the Oregon legislature to legalize physician-assisted suicide. So Oregon was the first state in the United States to legalize physician-assisted suicide in 94. And therefore, all of this development has been happening since and spreading from Oregon to other states of the Union. And little by little, each state has been legalizing up to 11 states today, right? Okay, now I have to go backwards a little bit to, again, the 70s and the 80s, because a key figure in the legalization of physician-assisted suicide was Dr. Jacob Kevorkian. Dr. Kevorkian. He was a pathologist, meaning that he was an expert on death because he would examine cadavers and determine the cause of death and so forth, all right? So he would give expert forensic testimony and so forth. And he was an MD, he was a medical doctor. So he was of the mentality that people should have a right to die or a right to kill themselves, really. So not really a right to die, but a right to kill themselves. And he just had that belief and he pushed it forward in the medical profession. And so at that time, that was illegal, of course. And therefore, he was actually tried. It's estimated that he assisted at least 130 patients to die, to kill themselves, all right, to go through a physician-assisted suicide. And he was the physician who was assisting. So again, I want to revisit these concepts that I spoke of earlier. Let me just put them here so that you have it. It doesn't have anything directly to do with this, but I just want to write it out. Let's put a text, the three actions, the three medical actions with regards to medication, getting a medication from a prescription to a patient, to the body of a patient, all right? The three passages. So a doctor prescribes, writes out the prescription. And that is medical and legal. The doctor is the only one, or also a nurse practitioner can also prescribe. They prescribe the medication. Then the pharmacist dispenses the medication, right? From the pharmacy, from the stock of medication. And then finally, the nurse is the one who administers the medication. Okay, and these three steps are key, crucial steps in getting a medication from a prescription, from a piece of paper, into the body of the patient who is in need of that medication, right? Now, traditionally, this process is for the purpose of healing the patient. So a patient has diabetes, they need insulin. The doctor prescribes the insulin, either as a pill or as an injection. The pharmacist dispenses that medication, and then it's the responsibility of the nurse to make sure that the patient takes the medication, right? Have you taken your medication today? And you'll notice that the nurse will walk into the room with the medication in one cup and some water on the other hand, all right? And the nurse may not leave the patient's room until the patient has taken the medication. So they have to make sure, the nurse has to make sure that the patient has taken the medication that is administering. And then the nurse will proceed to the computer station and document that the patient took this medication at this time, on this day, and so forth, so that there's a paper trail. It also has legal implications. But you notice that each one of the steps there is an ethical component. Should the doctor prescribe that medication? Is it the right or the wrong medication? Should the pharmacist dispense that medication, right? And should the nurse administer that medication? So you see, there are ethical components in each one of these steps. There should be ethical components. So Dr. Kevorkian, as an MD, was prescribing the lethal dosage for the patient, at least 130 of them. That is known because maybe he wasn't keeping records of all this. But back then, because it was not legal, then he was arrested and tried in cases of voluntary euthanasia. At least he was, according to his version, he was killing people who wanted to die. All right, so it was voluntary, it was not involuntary. Involuntary euthanasia is when people are killed and either they didn't want to die or we didn't know what their wishes were. And sometimes they would be unconscious. And again, it's the whole concept of putting them out of our misery. At any rate, he was convicted of second-degree murder and served 8 of a sentence of 10 to 25 years in prison. Then, in 2007, he was released. By that time, Compassion on Choices had moved forward quite a bit, and other states were already legalizing physician-assisted suicide. But he was released with the condition that he would not be involved in euthanasia, in actively killing patients, even if they wanted it, even if they asked for it. And where more investigation was done, it turns out that many of his patients were really not terminally ill. They were not in intractable pain, right? And for example, it's estimated that over just about a third of his patients were actually in pain. Some may have been hypochondriac, meaning that they were just afraid of pain or medication or the medical setting. They just had a fear for all that, but they really weren't terminally ill. Okay. Or perhaps depressed. And what happens with depression is very dangerous because in depression, the easy way out is to kill myself, right? That's why depression is so dangerous, because they may not have a terminal illness, but they are depressed for whatever overwhelming reason. And the easy way out is, well, I want to end it all. And so he was involved in that. In fact, he actually invented a machine that is a 2-step machine that was called the Kevorkian machine. And he put it online so that people could actually build this machine cheaply at home with stuff that he could buy at hardware and maybe at a drugstore, all right? It was a 2-step thing. First, there was a sedative that would render the person unconscious. And as that was going on, then the second dosage would kick in automatically. And the second dosage was precisely an overdose of potassium chloride, which would then provoke a heart attack on the sleeping person. And the heart attack would then kill the person, all right? So that was Kevorkian's death machine that was designed by him and then put online for free so people could build it. And therefore, it's not really known how many people actually use this machine to kill themselves over time. At any rate, Kevorkian himself developed a terminal illness, cancer of the liver through hepatitis C. And then the kidneys started to shut down, and then he developed pneumonia, and his scenario got complicated. Eventually, he ended up dying from a blood clot, a thrombosis, in 2011, when he was 83 years old. All right, so this was Dr. Kevorkian. He was also known as Dr. Death, who, for those of us who were living in these years in the 90s and early 2000s, but he gave a lot of credibility to the Right to Die movement. because himself, being a medical doctor, being a pathologist, his claim was that, well, people had a right to die, had a right to kill themselves when they thought, in their estimation, that they've had enough of this life. Then came the other case of Brittany Maynard. Now, this one is also very, very tragic and complicated. And I always want to say, we're never passing judgment on the conscience of the people, all right? Dr. Kevorkian may have thought that he had the best intentions in mind, and I don't pass judgment on his intentions and his conscience, but objectively speaking, that's what we do in principle bioethics, we can do an objective ethics, an objective morality, because we're looking at the action itself. And the action is that we don't really have a right to kill ourselves. We don't have a right to kill ourselves. And we don't have a right to engage others in killing ourselves when we are unable to get the lethal dosage because it's a prescribed medication. It's not over the counter. So by requesting the doctor to prescribe that medication, I am engaging that doctor in killing myself. See? So they are becoming what? They're becoming accessory. They are cooperating with the evil. And it's not just material cooperation, it's actual formal cooperation. Why? Because they do desire otherwise why prescribe a lethal dosage if the intention is not to kill the patient, right? If the intention is not to kill the patient, then the dosage is not going to be a lethal dosage. But to make that a lethal dosage, then the doctor needs to intend the killing of the patient, which contaminates the act and makes it, in fact, a formal cooperation with evil, even if the doctor is not literally the one who is administering or killing the patient. The patient is taking the medication themselves. Right, so now we look at Brittany Maynard. Brittany Maynard was born in 1984, in the 80s, and married in 2012. And she married Daniel Diaz. They lived in California. They didn't have any children, but they did have a dog, and that's the puppy dog that she was very fond of. They would go to the woods to walk the dog together, and they had a very happy life before she developed terminal brain cancer. So she developed brain cancer that was very aggressive. It's a rare cancer, but it's real, and it moved fast. It went from grade 2 to grade 4 in a matter of months. And when she was diagnosed with brain cancer, with the astrocytoma, there really was no cure for it, but they tried to slow it down and maybe arrest it by surgery to the brain. They remove a partial resection, is removing a section of the brain, all right, with a scalpel, cutting out a section of the brain of the temporal lobe, which is where the cancer had lodged. Temporal lobe is on the sides of the brain, on the hemispheres on either side, left side. Below, there's a parietal lobe on top, temporal lobe below, and the frontal lobe in the front of the brain, and the occipital in the back. So they do a craniotomy, which is to open the skull, and then the resectioning, which is surgically remove part of the temporal lobe where the tumor was. Of course, they cannot get down to the cellular level microscopically, and so they don't know if they've removed the entire tumor, actually, or it could have been already too lodged in, innervated, and so that craniotomy, that resectioning, didn't work that well because within 4 months, she was in grade 4, all right? In other words, advancing very fast. And so at that point, she was declared terminally ill, and the standard 6 months to live is a standard prognosis, very poor, declining fast. So what are some of the symptoms that she was experiencing? The most common symptom is headache, of course, because it's affecting the brain. And then as the tumor progresses, other symptoms that are more intense or prolonged can ensue, like for example, seizures, memory loss, physical weakness, loss of muscle control, because all these things are controlled by the brain, right? Visual symptoms, where they start seeing double or don't see well or blurry. Language, they cannot articulate well the words. Then cognitive decline, meaning they cannot think well any longer because it's affecting also other lobes of the brain. The tumor is increasing, is aggressive. And even personality changes. And it's understood that this personality changes is not for the better, but for the worse, okay? So all these symptoms are associated with gliocytoma or brain cancers that are incurable, fast-growing, and including pain. So at that point, see, she's still relatively young. The husband, Daniel, would support her in anything she decided. In other words, honey, it's your choice, it's your life, whatever you decide, I support you, so you make the call. Well, she was approached by Compassion and Choices, of course. She became the poster child, as it were, of Compassion and Choices. They generated a fund, which was the Britton and Maynard Fund, to collect money precisely to legalize physician-assisted suicide or aid in dying. There's aid, right? Aid in dying in the states where it was illegal. Now, she was living in California. And in California at that time, PAS was illegal, all right? So they moved to Oregon, where PAS was already legal. They moved to Oregon. And in Oregon, so physician-assisted suicide was legal in Oregon. To this day, it was, again, the first state. I think it was 94 when they legalized it. But it's for Oregonians. In other words, it's for residents of Oregon. What Oregon was trying to prevent is for people to come to Oregon to kill themselves. All right, just like people go to Vegas to marry. Well, then you can go to Vegas to marry and you can go to Oregon to kill yourself. So the legislature was crafted in such a way that only residents of Oregon could request physician-assisted suicide. And so she had to become an Oregonian resident before she could get the lethal dosage. And she did that. They moved and then they had to wait until November. Okay, so they moved. I think it was a 6-month thing that they had to wait. And the day after she was granted residency in Oregon, so she became a legal resident, she got the lethal dosage and killed herself. So the description, you can read more details about it. She got the lethal dosage, and her and Daniel just went to bed that night. She took the lethal dosage, and she died in Daniel's arms overnight, okay? Her family supported her fully in what she did and so forth. But frankly, objectively, without passing judgment on the conscience, she ended up killing herself because the doctor prescribed the lethal medication, but she actually self-administered, okay? What happens? The year after this, so this was November of 2014. In September of 2015, there had been several ballot efforts in California before November of 2014. There have been several ballot efforts in California to try to legalize physician-assisted suicide, and it had not passed by narrow margins, but it had not passed in the California legislature. Okay, in the California voting ballot. So by popular design or by popular vote, rather. But once this case happened, it had so much repercussion throughout the world. Okay, and I remember the news at the time. Of course, this is the picture that was shown for Britton Maynard before her tumor, as a young, happy, fully healthy human being, And then afterwards, with her decline and rapid decline of the brain tumor, where she was experiencing some, if not all, of these other symptoms. And so compassion kicks in, you know, the sense that she's suffering, she's in pain, you're being cruel if you don't allow her to kill herself. And she has the choice because we live in a free country and so forth. So you see that compassion and choices was very convenient for this particular situation, this particular patient, to move forward in this collaboration. So bottom line, in September of 2015, California lawmakers approve, and craft a law to legalize physician-assisted suicide in California, all right? So California finally becomes another state that legalizes physician-assisted suicide because of the case of Britton Maynard specifically. In other words, the legislatures in California are now feeling guilty that she had to move to Oregon, where she had no family, no connection, no nothing, and wait 6 months to become a legal resident and all that. So that was construed as cruelty to Brittany, and therefore to repair for that, the California lawmakers then legalized physician-assisted suicide in California and became another one of the states. These are listed chronologically, not chronologically, they're just listed alphabetically, but now there are these 11 states. Let me see if I got, this is the oldest. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. No, this is the good list. Yes, this is the up to date. I actually had to update it this morning because it turns out the latest state that has legalized physician-assisted suicide, New Mexico, just this month, okay? In April of 2021, the legislature in New Mexico finally approved physician-assisted suicide as one more state. So now there are 11 states that have legalized physician-assisted suicide. Going forward, this number is not decreasing, this number is increasing. So you can see that indeed, compassion and choices is a very effective strategy by going state by state, and each one of the states is little by little capitulating into legalizing physician-assisted suicide, right? And regardless of whatever acronym you want to use or euphemism, it is a suicide because the person is taking a lethal dosage. And it involves the medical profession with that suicide. So basically, what physician-assisted suicide does, it goes full term, full circle on the medical profession. Because if we go back millennia to the beginnings of medicine, which was associated with magic and potions that typically were herbal potions, in other words, coming from plants. There were some people in society that devoted themselves to the management of these potions, and they were the shamans or the doctors of the time, where they could administer the secret potion that would have some kind of an effect on people who typically were ill with something, and they would give them the magical potion to heal them or to kill them, all right? So originally shamans, which were like the precursors of doctors in human history, they were involved in either healing people or killing people, depending on many factors, depending on what the people wanted or how good that potion was actually. Sometimes they didn't know that well what they were doing, and the patient ended up dying instead of being cured. At any rate, these shamans, and it was also associated with some kind of spiritual, there was a ritual involved, there was burning of something, and there were dances and some kind of ritual going on to invoke the gods and to invoke the spirits, whether they were good spirits or evil spirits, so that the potion would work. And that is all going back to primitive cultures throughout the world. We see that all this whole shaman culture developing in many different primitive cultures throughout the world without having contact with each other. So it's something that seems to be innate in the human population, but it was not refined, okay? Because it was pre-scientific, and therefore these potions, these medications that were being used were very risky, because like I said, they could either kill the patient or heal the patient or do nothing. But then as medicine became more and more systematic and more formal, and the scientific method kicked in, of course, that's very recent in human history, only 500 to 600 years ago, where the scientific method actually of observation and experimentation is applied, and even testing on other animals before testing on the human and so forth, animal trials, whatever, then of course, the practice of medicine became more and more refined. But originally, even in classical Greece, the doctor was associated with either healing or killing. And so if the state needed to kill someone, and they wanted to do it in a humane way, in a compassionate way, they would not get the henchmen, right, to kill the person, the victim, by a lethal blow, either a sword or a spear or something like that. No, they would get a doctor to prescribe a lethal dosage. See, so originally, doctors, especially this is particularly true of classical Greece and Europe at the time, like I said, several centuries before the time of Christ, where the Greeks were already practicing some level of medicine in their society, in their culture, the doctor could either heal or kill. But then this doctor, Hippocrates, came up with the idea that the doctor should only be involved in healing and not in killing, because those two actions are incompatible. They are mutually exclusive. If the doctor is trying to heal a patient, then why should a doctor be involved in trying to kill a patient? All right. And so Hippocrates Hippocrates was this medical doctor in classical Greece, where he came up with the idea that the doctor should only be involved in healing patients, not killing patients. All right, he's from the 5th to the 4th century before Christ, and he comes up with the famous Hippocratic Oath. All right, so let's look briefly at the Hippocratic Oath. It's undergone several transformations, but it was basically an oath to the gods of the time, because remember, Greek mythology is a very rich mythology, but it's polytheistic, where it has several gods, and there is one of the gods is the god of healing. It's associated with Mercury in particular, and Mercury has the little wings on his feet, right, and is carrying the caduceus. The wings on the feet is that Mercury will fly quickly to the aid of a ill patient and provide the medication. Let's see. Look at a little bit here. Greek mythology, just there. Oh, yes. Okay. So this is yes, this is the Roman version of the Greek god of Mercury. You see, it's got little wings on his feet and also on his helmet, and will fly quickly to the aid of the patient. Now, this object that Mercury carries is called caduceus, or caduceus. And the caduceus or caduceus to this day is a symbol of medical practice, okay? And it is a staff with two snakes, going up. I believe the one snake is for pharmacists, but two snakes is for medical doctors. And this is a reference to classical Old Testament of Moses raising the staff with two snakes when a bronze snake, when people in the Exodus were being bitten, right? When people in the Exodus were being bitten, the Hebrew people fleeing from slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land, to the freedom of the Promised Land, where they are to this day in Israel, the state of Israel, they had to go through the desert region. And in the desert region, there are certain snakes that are called aspids, and these aspids are very venomous. They can spring up and jump, and they have very powerful venom. So they were being bitten by the snakes, and the idea was that when they got bitten, God told Moses, make a snake, a bronze snake, and mount it on a pole, and raise the pole, and whenever someone gets bitten by a snake, if they look at the pole, then they will heal. It's a mythological description, it's an allegorical description. We have to be very careful because that allegory could be interpreted as as idolatry, right? A bronze snake mounted on a pole, and if you get sick, if you get bitten by the snake and you look at the pole, you get healed, then it sounds like magic and it sounds like idolatry, right, of a material object. But obviously, if it's in the Old Testament and if God is directing Moses to do this, then it cannot be idolatry. It has a deeper meaning. And it has been interpreted. So we also say in the Judeo-Christian tradition that the New Testament is the key to interpret the Old Testament, right? That the Old Testament is incomplete without the New Testament, because it's the New Testament that is the key of interpretation. And there are many passages in the Old Testament that don't really make much sense as a standalone, but in the light of the New Testament, if we interpret the Old Testament through the eyes of the New Testament, then they make sense. And what is this snake that is on a pole? Well, it is Jesus Christ on the cross. It is the crucifixion of Christ. And so it is precisely that two-edged sword. The cross killed Jesus, but also through his death and burial, he rose to eternal life, all right? He rose from the dead. And so that's the two-edged sword. The two-edged sword is that the snake can actually kill the person, but the snake can actually heal the person. And to this day, snake venom is used for healing. It has certain properties that it can actually cure and heal people. And so it always comes down to the dosage, right? And we know that snake venom is used throughout the world in medical research and in medical cures. For example, when people do get bitten by snakes, and they don't have an antibody for it because it's maybe the first time they get bitten by the snakes, if they receive a transfusion of blood that has the antibodies, then that transfusion of blood can heal them. So indirectly, they're being healed by the blood of another person who was bitten by the snake and survived. And therefore that blood with the antibodies is precious and is used in medicine to heal other people. So those are a couple of examples where a poison can either cure or kill, right? it depends on the dosage, All right, so that is the caduceus, which is the symbol of medicine to this day, and the two snakes, the two winding snakes are an allegory to, it's a reference to Moses raising up the bronze snake on a pole as they were journeying through the desert into the promised land. And where was I? Back to, okay, so Hippocratic Oath, Hippocrates, you can look at it and so forth. Here is the original, the Greek oath, and then the translation into English. It has been translated in several ways. But basically, the first principle of medicine that comes from the Hippocratic Oath is this little dictum: first, do no harm. First, do no harm. And we have to understand in what context is do no harm, right? Because that is like the core of the Hippocratic Oath, the do no harm. That means that the doctor should be involved in healing and not in killing, and not injuring their patient and not killing their patient. So that is where the great value of the Hippocratic Oath for millennia, for over 2,000 years had been used. In fact, this oath was kind of the culmination of a medical student in their career, in their studies, and the time of graduation, they would take the Hippocratic Oath. They used to. Then it has been replaced by a number of other oaths, and today even no oath at all. Or if the medical students want to take some kind of a oath, they're just told by their teachers, by their professors, well, you write your own oath, your own code of ethics, and then swear to that if you want to. You don't need to have an oath at all right? So it has gotten very utilitarian, frankly, the practice of medicine in many places. Of course, there are still some universities, typically private universities or private medical schools, that do the Hippocratic Oath or some version of it. But part of the challenge is that in part of the Hippocratic Oath is I will not prescribe a pessary to a pregnant woman, a pessary meaning I will not prescribe a lethal dosage to a pregnant woman, essentially to cause an abortion, all right? So it is a pro-life. The Hippocratic Oath in its original construct is pro-life. It's not pro-choice, right? It precludes to prescribe an abortion to a pregnant woman. So that's why it has been eliminated, certainly in the public medical schools and many other parts of the United States and Europe. But the first principle of do no harm, at least that stands. Also, while I'm at it, it's important to understand in what context, because for example, if a person has a broken bone and they delay a little bit in getting that bone healed, and then they have to go to the hospital finally, eventually, or see the orthopedic surgeon, the orthopedic surgeon may have to re-break the bone to set it correctly, right? So that it heals correctly and not crookedly. So what about resetting that bone? That may be considered doing harm, but the intention, the big picture is to do a local harm, a small local harm to the greater good of the healing itself. Even surgery, traditional classical surgery with a scalpel, well, the skin has to be open, the tissue, the body has to be opened with a scalpel, which can be seen in a narrow sense as doing some harm, right? But the greater good is to take out the appendix because the person is having appendicitis, and if the doctor doesn't take out the appendix and that appendix ruptures, it may definitely kill the person, the patient. And so the doctor has to do some kind of a surgery, even if it's laparoscopic, some kind of incision to take out the appendix, okay? So we have to look at the medical act as a whole, not just the incision of the scalpel, which in itself locally is a harm, a localized harm, but the bigger picture is that, first of all, it's done with anesthesia and so forth, but the bigger picture is that this is definitely the way to heal this patient. And therefore, in the big picture of an appendectomy, just to give one example of a surgical procedure, the doctor did not do harm. In fact, the doctor healed, all right? So he abode by the principle of do no harm. All right, let me see, let me retract back to, yes. So what we have then is that an increasing number of states are legalizing physician-assisted suicide. And this number, like I say, in time is not going backwards, it's going forward. And so there are at least 24 states right now that they have in the workings of their legislature to legalize physician-assisted suicide, including Florida. Florida is another target state. Why? Because we have a significant population of elderly, for example, which become candidates for physician-assisted suicide. And therefore, I know for a fact that one of the target states for compassion and choices is Florida. It's also a difficult state, thanks be to God. It's a difficult state to get PAS approved here, legalized, because of another case that we had in the state in the 90s and 2000, which was Terry Schiavo, and I'll cover that in the context of nutrition and hydration, all right? The case of Terry Schiavo. We'll get there, so I'm gonna bracket it for now, but definitely Florida and about 24 other states are in the scope of compassion and choices to get physician-assisted suicide legalized. And the goal, of course, eventually is to get all 50 states, right? And then they would have, in fact, achieved the same goal as if there had been a dictum given by the Supreme Court, let's say, at the federal level, but without the hassle of the immense expense that it would cost to do that and to try to get the whole population, right, as a whole of the United States to agree with this. Going state by state is tactically more efficient, and that's what they're doing. So we have to raise antennas and be careful and be alert, because it is a movement that is pushing this agenda of the person's right to kill themselves, to the suicide. Now, before I get here, there's another aspect that I want to talk about, which is on the Nursing Association, ANA. So you've heard of AMA, the American Medical Association, but there's also the American Nursing Association, ANA, American Nursing Association. And what has happened here is that for a moment. Excuse me for a minute. I had it. Give me a minute. Let me pause the recording for a moment while I look at this. So I had it in my folder. Okay, so I found the position paper that I was looking for. It's a statement from 2019, just before COVID came on the scene, or the coronavirus. But basically at their national convention of 2019, it was discussed whether the ANA, the American Nurses Association, should endorse or be involved in any way in physician-assisted suicide. In other words, when a patient requests aid in dying. And you see, they're using MAID here, medical aid in dying, right? So I talked about this alternative phrasing. Here they're using MAID, medical aid in dying. In fact, they're not using PAID, because that would be physician aid in dying. And physician is a medical doctor, it's an MD. But medical aid in dying could be a nurse, not necessarily a doctor, right? So should the medical profession, including nurses, be involved in aid in dying, particularly because of the role of the nurse that the nurse is the one who administers the medication. In the case of PAS, it would be the nurse administering the lethal dosage. Okay? So whether they should be involved in that, whether they should be coerced. What if a patient requires it and it's legal, let's say in any one of these 11 states, it is legal, the patient is requiring the lethal dosage. Does the nurse have a conscience clause that says this is against my values and my principles and I want to be excluded from this procedure? Then the hospital or the nursing home or the clinic or whatever setting would have to find someone else, an alternative nurse to administer, because the patient is in bed, cannot get physically the medication unless it's given to the patient. Follow? So that was a challenge, and my understanding is that they stayed neutral, they did not endorse it or deny it, but they stay neutral. But what I'm trying to say is that it came up. It came up at the Natural Convention of the ANA. You can read it in more detail if you want, but for now, they stay neutral on physician-assisted suicide, or as they're calling it, medical aid in dying. But already using this alternative phrasing is telling you that they are getting rid of the suicide, the PAS, original acronym. Where was it? Yeah. Okay. PAS, physician-assisted suicide, down to here. They're using medical aid in dying. But when you go to the legislation descriptions of each state, of these 11 states, you will find that they talk about PAS, PAD, they use any one of these acronyms back and forth, any one of these alternative phrasing back and forth, all right? So that's where the conversation is right now. It is not clear where it's going to go, whether the nurse is going to participate or not, whether, not the nurse in particular, but this association, which represents many nurses throughout the United States, and it's the official, let's say, association of nurses, the ANA. You can read the document, and there is the conscience clause there, right? Then whether it's respected or not, what kind of legal recourse they have is obviously the challenge, because they're not supposed to, let's say a nurse takes exception to PAS or to aid or MAY, whatever they want to call it, and doesn't want to administer the lethal dosage, then the hospital needs to find another nurse to administer that dosage who is in favor. Obviously, the nurse would be in favor of that. But then, is that refusal going to jeopardize this nurse's position, employment, continued employment? Okay, it gets tricky, it gets legalistic, and it may put them in jeopardy of continued employment. And even if legally they cannot fire the person because of the conscience clause, they can make life miserable for that person by refusing to administer the lethal dosage, okay? So it's becoming increasingly more difficult to stay pro-life at the end of life in this kind of setting, this kind of environment where you have already over one fifth of the nation's states having legalized physician-assisted suicide. Right? So that's the state of affairs. Like I say, the latest one is just this month with New Mexico. All right. To wrap it up, then, this little saying that I found, and it's invariably attributed to either Nietzsche or Kierkegaard, which I find interesting because I have not been able to actually pinpoint who came up with this saying or a facsimile. Okay, it may not have been worded exactly like this, but this is a sentiment. Life is not a problem to be solved, not a problem to solve, but a mystery to be lived. And this, to me, actually crystallizes the distinction and the opposite focus of a utilitarian ethics versus a principle ethics, utilitarian bioethics or principle bioethics. In other words, if it's utilitarian, they got to be focusing on problems. All of life is just one problem after another that needs to be solved. Okay, so I get a flat tire, I go to the tire place and I get the tire either fixed or replaced. I got a problem, got a flat tire, right? But when we talk about human beings, we are not problems, all right? And when we're seen as problems, either to ourselves and to others, that's a problem, because that is an unfair and a demeaning view of human life and human beings. Ultimately, we are a mystery. We are a mystery. So the big questions in philosophy and in ethics and theology is, who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Okay, why are we here? Those are the big questions, which are metaphysical questions. They go beyond the physical. And even if we can trace our evolutionary origins through the process of natural selection, like I did in the first course of the program, right? That only explains the physiological development up to the genus Homo, or even the species Homo sapiens. But metaphysically, in other words, the creation of a soul and the fact that we have a conscience and so forth, and that conscience is ultimately called to eternal life, and that we even speak of a glorified body in eternal life and so forth. Those are questions of belief, and so they don't fall into the category of solving problems, but rather, I mean, why do we suffer? Why do we have this capacity for suffering? And why do we have a certain tolerance to suffering? Why can we spiritualize? Why is it that we may actually spiritualize suffering and glean redemptive value from it? All right? These are questions that go beyond the physical, the physiological, and even the psychological into the spiritual realm. So ultimately, our life is a mystery. Like I mentioned earlier, none of us asked to be alive, but at some point, we realize that we are alive, okay? When we become aware of self. Even that self-awareness doesn't happen immediately, certainly not even after birth, all right? Immediately after birth, a little baby, the first few months of life, they don't really have a concept of self. I don't know if you've ever seen those little videos of a baby in front of a mirror. They're trying to get into the mirror because they think it's another one on the other side. They don't really have a concept of self, all right? And that comes up little by little, gradually, over months, maybe even years, and that is refined. It takes years to refine our concept of self, distinguished from other individuals who are around us. And so really we discover our own existence gradually as we grow. And therefore, we're dealing with a mystery. And the same at the end of life, it is also a mystery, that passage onto eternal life, which is out of belief. There's no proof, no tangible, effective proof for eternal life. We cannot measure it. It's not empirical, all right? So it's out of the realm of science because it cannot be measured. But there is belief. And I've pointed this out again in that first course. That's why that first course is fundamental, because every primitive culture, human culture that we have discovered, they have some kind of representation of the world beyond, all right? And they have either paintings or some kind of ritual or music, and we don't see any of that in any other animal species here on Earth. We are the only ones that have this kind of symbolic, and the big one, of course, at least in my understanding, is the burying of the dead. Why bury the dead? Even clothes and everything else with food, everything is pointing to a belief in something after death. And we find that belief in many different cultures throughout the world, primitive cultures that go back thousands and thousands of years, independent of each other, and yet sooner or later it arises. We find it there in what is known as the material culture of that civilization. And so it seems to be a universal belief of the afterlife. So ultimately, we're dealing with a mystery. And that mystery is the life that we have here on Earth, how we live it, right? Therefore, the mystery to be lived. Day by day, we never know what is going to happen tomorrow, day after tomorrow, even later today. We never really know for sure what's going to happen. It will take us by surprise. So that basic openness to life and to will the good, that's what we call benevolence. I've also pointed out in the context of the practice of medicine and how the medical doctor or the medical profession, including the pharmacist and the nurse, should not be involved in killing their patients. We should be only involved in healing, all right? The fact that the practice of medicine itself is considered against natural selection, in the sense that medicine enables the weaker one among us. It is on average, then I understand it's a statistic, it's a probabilistic model, but on average, it is the weaker among us who are getting ill, right? They're more susceptible. And so we can say that on average, they are genetically less fit, for example, and yet we practice medicine. Practicing medicine from that perspective of natural selection, it goes against natural selection in that we are enabling the weaker ones to live, to continue living. And especially when the practice of medicine is done on people who are in either reproductive years or before the reproductive years. Why? Because it's enabling those who are weaker to continue to grow and live into the reproductive years and potentially pass on that weakness to the next generation. So we can say that the practice of medicine in general, globally, does weaken the human species somewhat, all right? At least theoretically, because it is enabling the weaker ones to reach reproductive age and therefore potentially pass on that weakness, that genetic weakness, whatever it is. However, realistically, in the practical realm, first of all, we understand, and it's sad and tragic, but a reality that many people throughout life and throughout the world don't have access to medicine, all right? And in fact, it may actually be the majority of the world population, I really don't know, but when we think that we have about 8 billion people on the planet, and many of them live in crowded conditions, not healthy conditions, et cetera, where there's not even running water available, not alone drinking water, then many people throughout the world don't have access to medical practice or even the basics of healthcare. And therefore, this issue that medicine works against natural selection, theoretically, yes. But in practice, we still practice medicine. And why do we practice medicine if it potentially is weakening our species, right? We don't see any other species on Earth practicing medicine. Well, it's because of these two principles here. These two principles, benevolence, which is to will the good, bene volere, these two words, as you know, many words in our vocabulary are compound words that come from Latin, and Latin itself comes from Greek, so it goes back centuries or millennia into the etymology of the word, the meaning, the origin and meaning of the word. So volere or volens, volens is the will, that's how we get will or vil. Okay, so V and W are interchangeable in old, even English, but certainly the Romance languages. So volere is to will, and bene, the good. Benevolencia, we say in Spanish, is very similar. Benevolencia is to desire the good, to will the good. And we will the good to ourselves and to other people around us. That's natural from our nature. And it's the way it should be, right? And because we can will the good, then we should do the good. We can will the good, and therefore we should do the good. And beneficence, facere, this comes from facere or factum, which is a fact or to do, all right, a doing. So facere, to do the good, to do the good. Beneficencia, we say in Spanish, benevolencia and beneficencia. In other words, we desire the good, we're capable of desiring the good, and therefore we should do the good. Again, we're the only species. No other species can actually desire or will the good because they have no concept of the good, because they have no concept of the evil either, right? So when animals kill each other, they're not guilty of murder. They're just going by instinct, feeding themselves. All right, so bottom line, we engage in the practice of medicine in spite of the fact that in the big picture, at least theoretically, it may weaken the human species genetically. In fact, we practice medicine because we can will the good, and because we can will the good, we should also do the good, right? So it gets us back to the first principle of medicine, which is do no harm. First, do no harm. And therefore, the doctor, the bottom line of this particular lecture is that the doctor, the pharmacist, the nurse, and even the healthcare administrator's profession should not be involved either in euthanasia, directly killing patients, or assisting in the death of patients by prescribing lethal dosage. They should stay away from this practice, at least from the principal bioethics analysis, because otherwise it brings that medical profession, that health profession back to its primitive origin of the shaman, whereby the shaman either healed or killed, which means that they are being given a power that doesn't really belong to humans. We do not have the power, the authority to kill people, and therefore the medical profession should stay away from it, okay? All right, friends, that's all I have for today's lecture. Going forward then, next week, with God's help, we'll look at the case of nutrition and hydration, because again, it's complicated, especially when the person is in a vegetative state. What to do with regards to nutrition and hydration, because in principle, nutrition and hydration are ordinary means of life support, all right? In other words, eating and drinking water or fluids, hydrating ourselves is part of normal maintenance of our health, of our body. But in some cases, they may become extraordinary means of life support. I'm going to see that case next week. Any questions, comments, anything from those of you? I think you're all online today. So if you're...
Thank you, Father Chofi. Very interesting topic.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome.
See you next week.
Good. All right. So I hear no questions or comments other than that. I'm going to close it then and send you the video. Thanks again. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you. Have a great week.
Bye.